Alla Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese, and welcome to Tolkien Untangled. My name is Rainbow Dave, and this is our third episode in the tale of Fëanor and the Silmarils. So, in the last episode, I talked about how the Dark Lord Melkor had sown dissent and rebellion amongst the Noldorin elves. Now, this ill will had spread especially amongst the Noldorin royal family, and the former High King of the Noldor now lives in banishment with his beloved son Fëanor in the stronghold of Formenos. And it is Finwë's second son, Fingolfin, who now wears the High King's crown. So up in Formenos, Fëanor keeps his precious Silmarils under constant lock and key. But the real danger lies in the south, where Melkor has discovered a creature of unimaginable gluttony, the dark spider, Ungoliant. Now, before we can go on with the story, I need to talk a bit about Ungoliant, because along with Tom Bombadil and the nameless things that live beneath Moria, Ungoliant is the most mysterious character in all of Tolkien's legendarium. Like, what is she? It's a good question, and the answer is, we don't really know. We know she's not one of the Valar. There are only 15 created by Eru, technically 14 because Melkor is no longer counted among them. But some people think that Ungoliant might be a dark Maya, similar to a Balrog, who simply chose the form of a monstrous spider. Now, this is very possible, and it would place Ungoliant on par with Sauron. However, unlike many other dark Maya, Ungoliant is no follower of Melkor. She's not a follower of anyone. Her only allegiance is to herself and her insatiable hunger. There is, however, one other theory about Ungoliant's origins. Some people believe that she might be a manifestation of the void itself. In other words, she is darkness and nothingness incarnate that somehow willed itself into the world in corporeal form. Now, we don't know what the truth is, I'm afraid, but what we do know is that Ungoliant has an unending hunger to devour light. For although she despises light, and she is its total opposite, she consumes it as her food. So, Melkor appealed to Ungoliant, and he offered to make an alliance with her. He proposed that together they could darken Valinor forever and rule the races of Middle-earth as gods of darkness. Now, Ungoliant is sorely tempted by Melkor's promises, but she is hesitant, for she's not a fool and she fears the powers of the Valar. But to entice her further, Melkor offered Ungoliant anything she desired to satiate her boundless hunger, and eventually she agreed, and she set her sights upon the greatest of all the lights in Aman. So back in Valinor, Manwë, the king of the Valar, has organized a massive festival called the High Feast. Which I always think it sounds like something you do in Amsterdam, doesn't it? But the idea behind this feast was that it praises Eru Ilúvatar and it celebrates the time for gathering fruit. Kind of like a harvest festival, I guess, except for the gods. Now, I must say, Manwë does also have a second motive for making this celebration so special. So, he's witnessed these hostilities that have grown amongst the Noldor, and Manwë wants to see them mended. So, he invited the Noldor princes to his mansion called Ilmarinen, where he lived with his wife Vada atop the world's tallest mountain, Taniquetil. And the Noldor aren't the only ones who get an invite. Manwë also invited a number of the Vanyarin elves to come and join in the celebrations. And as well as elves, there's also a whole host of Maiar who show up at the High Feast. In fact, the only elves that aren't at the feast are the Teleri of Alqualonde. And that's because the Teleri are sea elves. And so it makes sense, I guess, that the time for gathering fruit is just not particularly relevant to them. But anyway, Tolkien writes that the Noldor, the Vanya, and the Maiar all sing together for Manwë and Varda, and they all face the two trees of Valinor in unison. Now, it might sound a bit weird that all these super powerful beings are just singing together, but in Tolkien's Legendarium, music, and particularly singing, are very closely connected with magic, especially elven magic. Now, we're going to see this a lot more clearly later in the story, but it's worth remembering that in our first ever episode, Ea, the universe, is created by Eru Ilúvatar and the music of the Ainur. In fact, that word Ainur, which kind of means the creation of the universe, what it literally means, it's an elven word for the music of the Ainur. But anyway, Fingolfin, the now High King of the Noldor, accepts Manwë's invitation and he agrees that it is finally time to mend this rift that exists between him and Fëanor. And Fingolfin's eldest son, Fingon, also wants to make peace, because Fingon used to have a really close relationship with his cousins, the sons of Fëanor, and especially with Fëanor's eldest son, Maedhros the Tall. You see, back in Tirion, Fingon and Maedhros had once been inseparable. So anyway, Manwë sent messages inviting/commanding Fëanor to attend the celebrations. Now, Fëanor was reluctant to make peace, but his sons did really want to end their banishment. And in his exile, I guess Fëanor has learnt at least a little bit of humility. So, albeit begrudgingly, Fëanor does agree to make the journey and to reconnect with the rest of his people, the rest of the Noldor. However, Fëanor leaves the Silmarils safely locked away in Formenos. And they aren't the only things that he left behind. See, Fëanor's own father, Finwë, also remained in Formenos. And he did so kind of out of spite towards the Valar. So Finwë said that as long as his son is banished from Tirion, he held himself unkinged, and he refused to meet with any of his people. So, Fëanor came to Taniquetil alone, and he stood before the thrones of Manwë and Varda. Now, Tolkien actually writes that Fëanor wore no raiments of festival, nor any jewels, nor anything of gold or silver. But it's here that he is reunited with his half-brother, and now his rightful king, Fingolfin. But contrary to what you might expect by now, Fëanor does actually do a semi-decent thing here. He agrees to reconcile, or at least in word he does. Which means Fingolfin now has a very difficult choice. But he doesn't really spend that much time, or any time really, struggling to make it. You see, pretty immediately, Fingolfin extends his hand and totally forgives Fëanor for everything. And I think, deep down, Fingolfin knew that as the second son, he didn't really have a right to the throne in the first place, especially as his older brother and father are both still alive. So, in front of Manwë and Varda and the rest of the Valar, as well as the Maiar and the Vanya and the Noldor, Fingolfin said to Fëanor, "Thou shalt lead, and I shall follow." Which basically meant he gave up his throne and the kingship, and he offered it to his half-brother. And I think this gives us a real insight into Fingolfin's character. Tolkien actually wrote that he is the strongest and most valiant of the three brothers. And I guess it's this valiance that explains why Fingolfin makes this humble and incredibly selfless choice. And this choice is... well, actually, we'll soon see whether this was the right choice or not, won't we? But anyway, unsurprisingly, Fëanor is pretty stoked about all this, and he eagerly declared, so be it. So for the first time, possibly ever, Fëanor and Fingolfin take each other's hands and make peace. And as this happens, way beneath them, on the mound of Azelohar, the two trees of Valinor shine particularly bright, and they bathe all of Valinor in a radiant gold and silver. So this is pretty good, right? This is good. Everything's going pretty well. But literally in that same hour, things start to go horribly wrong, because this is the moment that Melkor returns with Ungoliant. And remember, Ungoliant loves to eat light. So, I'll give you one guess where they're headed. Yup. So, this is one of our first really huge moments in the story. Now, the unlight of Ungoliant seeps into the roots of the trees, and Melkor climbed the mound of Azelohar, and with his black spear he smote the trees right down to their core, and their divine sap spilled like blood onto the ground. Now this sap Ungoliant sucked up, and then she went from tree to tree and stuck her black beak into their wounds, and drained all the light out of them. And the poison of death from Ungoliant's bite withered the tree's roots and branches and leaves until the trees were dead. But still, this wasn't enough for Ungoliant. She moved onto the wells of Vardar and she drank them dry of light. But the power of this divine light is starting to do crazy things to the giant spider, and she begins to belch forth these black vapors. And as she drinks, she swells to such a monstrous shape and size that even Melkor becomes afraid. And whenever I imagine this scene, I always think of Ungoliant as being a bit like a black hole. You know, like no light can escape her. Nothing can. But from the peak of Taniquetil, the Valar and the Maiar and the elves aren't really able to see what's happening. And the reason for that is because Ungoliant has hidden herself and Melkor inside a shroud made from dark webs of unlight. Now, in Tolkien's Legendarium, and I guess also the real world, darkness isn't really a thing in and of itself, you know? It's just the absence of light. But Ungoliant's unlight is definitely the exception to this. Now, it's never used by anyone but her, and it's as much a weapon as it is a defense. You see, it's totally impenetrable, and it's a real force of dread. Now, Tolkien actually tells us that unlight enters the heart and the mind, and it strangles the will. So anyway, that sounds horrible, but although the Valar may not be able to see what's happening, as soon as the trees die, they know something terrible must have occurred. For the first time since the destruction of the lamps way back when they were living in Almaren, Aman is plunged into darkness. Now, this must be especially traumatic for Vardar. She is the goddess of light, and now all that she has left are her stars, silently defying the enveloping darkness. And so, Manwë, the king, he is the only one with eyes powerful enough to have any idea what had just happened. And as he looked down, he saw a huge mass of black moving northward at incredible speed. Now, Manwë knew this must be Melkor, so he sent two of the most dangerous Valar to hunt him down. First, is Orome, who's actually the Lord of the Hunt, so you'd think this would be pretty easy for him, but it's certainly not. You see, the earth shook beneath the fiery hooves of his great steed, Nahar. But as soon as he reached the clouds of unlight, Orome was blinded and dismayed, and his great hunting horn, the Valaroma, was silenced. Now the other Valar who goes out to hunt Melkor is his old enemy, Tulkas the Champion. But Tulkas encounters the same problem as his brother-in-law Orome, and he too is caught in the black net of night. So both Valar are utterly powerless to do anything but beat the air in vain, and by the time the darkness has passed, Melkor is long gone. So when the rest of the Valar and the Maiar and all the elves all descended from Taniquetil to assess the damage, Manwë ordered his winds to drive away the vapors of death. And Yavanna, the bearer of fruit, climbed the mound of Azelohar, and she touched the trees. But as she did, the branches fell lifeless at her feet. Now, just to make this even more tragic, remember, Yavanna is the one who made these trees in the first place. They're her creation, but because she used so much of her power to make them the first time, she can't ever do it again. So the Valar decide to, well, do what they do best, and they hold a meeting in their Ring of Doom to pretty much discuss where they're going to go from here. And Yavanna tells them that although the trees are destroyed, she could possibly recall them back to life if she had just a little bit of that light left to work with. Now, if you guys have been paying attention and you've seen the other videos, you might actually be figuring out that there is a solution to this problem, but it involves asking a favor of Fëanor. So, you guys remember the Silmarils? Yeah, of course you do. Well, when Fëanor forged them, he captured the light of the trees in crystal form, didn't he? And that's what made the jewel so powerful. So, Manwë, here he is, and he's thinking, well, why can't we just crack open these Silmarils, give the light to Yavanna, and then she can sort us out a new pair of trees? And the rest of the Valar agree, this is a great idea. So, once again, Fëanor is summoned to the Ring of Doom. So, Manwë explains his plan, and he asks Fëanor to hand over the Silmarils. But Fëanor refused. See, Fëanor said that the Silmarils are forged from his essence, and he could never ever again make anything like them. Then he thought about what Melkor had said to him, and he feared that the Valar were indeed trying to steal his precious jewels. And so Fëanor said that if the Silmarils were ever to be broken open, then he would be the first ever elf to be slain in their defense. Now, the Valar are all kind of stunned into silence by this, except for one. Mandos, the keeper of the dead and the doomsman of the Valar, said 3 foreboding words. Not the first. Now, at the time, neither Fëanor nor any of the other Valar had any idea what Mandos was talking about. But this ominous message spooked Fëanor, and he thought about his Silmarils, and he wondered, are they truly safe? The last time he saw them, they were in Formenos, under his father Finwë's protection. So, he ran straight from the Ring of Doom and fled into the darkness. Now, back at Formenos, Finwë must have been as alarmed as anyone else when the light of the trees went out. But before long, he saw a great shadow approaching. Now, at this point, all of Formenos was gripped by dread, but Finwë alone stood against the horror. However, no one had ever seen anything like this before. See, after eating all that light, Ungoliant has grown into an immense darkness, and with her came Melkor. And the two of them, they arrived at the very doors of Formenos, but Finwë held his ground. Now, in the last episode, I think I said something about Finwë maybe not being the best father in the world, but in this moment, he truly and utterly redeems himself. For Finwë stands alone against the two most powerful beings in Arda, and also the two most evil. But Finwë flees from no one. And so, just as Mandos prophesied, Finwë's blood is the first blood to be spilled in Valinor, and the former High King of the Noldor is murdered by the Dark Lord. And with his death comes the final end to the days of peace. But Melkor did not come all the way to Formenos just to kill an old king. What he wants are the Silmarils, and they are exactly what Ungoliant wants too. So they found Fëanor's chamber of iron, and Melkor rent it open. And inside he found hundreds of gems that Fëanor had crafted in his lifetime. But Melkor had no interest in them. He gave the lesser gems to Ungoliant and she devoured them all, but the Silmarils Melkor took for himself. But I do have to say that this is where Melkor makes another mistake. Remember when Fëanor first made the Silmarils and he took them to the Valar and showed them off? Well, Vada hallowed them, didn't she? And she decreed that neither mortal flesh nor anything of evil would be able to touch them. Any unclean hand would be scorched and withered, and that is exactly what happens to Melkor. The Silmarils burn his flesh, and he endures unbelievable agony just to hold them. But he does not let go. Because although the Silmarils scour his skin, they now belong to him. But I should say, right, Melkor does shoot himself in the foot just a little bit here. Because Tolkien says that the pain of holding the Silmarils never ever leaves him. And so I guess Melkor just is in agony every day for the rest of his life. Now, I can't say I feel bad for him. In fact, I think it's hilarious. But the power of the Silmarils also prevents Melkor from ever again changing his shape. So he's now permanently bound into an incarnate form and stuck in a tall and terrible body. And so I guess Melkor's days of deception are well and truly over. He may have the Silmarils, but they've come at a cost. However, this pain hardly even slows Melkor down, and he and Ungoliant flee immediately north to the very tip of Aman. And here they come to the frozen sea called the Helcaraxe, also known as the Grinding Ice. And because it's technically ocean that had frozen over, it's actually the only bridge between the western continent of Aman and the dark eastern lands of Middle-earth. And it is Middle-earth where Ungoliant and Melkor are bound. And this actually marks the last time that Melkor ever sets foot in Aman. You see, now that he's trapped and limited to one physical body, he never ever returns to the Undying Lands. Anyway, by the time that Fëanor finally made it back to Formenos, he found he was too late. His beloved father Finwë had been murdered and his home had been sacked. But worst of all, the Silmarils were gone, stolen by the enemy. And I'm afraid that is where I am going to end the story for this episode. But do not worry, because next week there will be another episode coming to continue the journey. So make sure you hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss that, and leave a like or a comment if you choose. But we just have enough time left for another Tolkien Fun Fact. So today's fun fact is actually a bit of a sad one, to be honest, because it's about the fates of the dwarves in the company of Thorin. Or I guess it's about the fates of 3 of them. So 48 years after the events of The Hobbit, Balin, who was Bilbo's closest friend on the quest, along with Gimli's uncle Owen and this guy Ori, all venture to Moria to try and reclaim it from the orcs. Now, all of you who have seen Fellowship of the Ring will know this doesn't go well, and the tomb that we see in the movie and in the book is the tomb of Balin. But what you may not know is what happens to Owen and Ori. So Gimli's uncle, Owen, goes off to try and find another way out, and he journeys all the way to the other side of Moria and comes out at the door of Durin, where the Fellowship go in. But unfortunately for Owen, this is a dangerous place, and Owen is actually grabbed and presumably drowned, killed by the Watcher in the water. So if anyone ever asks you what do Gimli and Luke Skywalker both have in common, the answer is they both have a dead Uncle Owen. Too soon? Oh well. So the last dwarf I'll talk about is Ori, who in the Hobbit movies we're told is the youngest of the dwarves, even though in the book Tolkien explicitly says that Fili and Kili are the youngest by over 50 years, so I can't really tell you what Peter Jackson was thinking there. But anyway, Ori is the last survivor of Balin's colony, and he's actually the one who writes the final account in the book of Mazabul, which means this guy in Fellowship of the Ring is actually this guy in The Hobbit. Kind of sad when you think about it like that. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevaya Melanin.